The carriage struck the fallen branch at the worst possible bend in the road, and Miss Sarah Pelham found herself thrown sideways against the door with enough force to knock the breath entirely out of her. "Are you injured?" a voice asked, from somewhere across the overturned compartment. "I do not believe so," Sarah said, righting herself with as much dignity as the situation permitted, which was very little. "Are you?" "Nothing beyond my pride," the voice said, and a tall figure climbed free of the wreckage ahead of her, extending a hand to help her down. "Forgive me, we have not been introduced. Julian Ashby." "Sarah Pelham," she said, accepting the hand and stepping out into a downpour that had clearly been waiting for precisely this moment to intensify. She was 24, with dark hair already coming loose in the rain, traveling alone to Bath to take up a position as companion to an elderly aunt, her trunk strapped to the back of a coach she had shared, by unhappy coincidence, with a stranger heading the same direction. The driver, she noted with some alarm, was nowhere in sight, having apparently gone for help the moment the wheel splintered. She had boarded that coach that morning with a carefully constructed plan for the entirety of her future. Modest wages, quiet companionship, a small room of her own in Bath, and no particular expectation of anything beyond steady survival. She had built that plan deliberately, over several years, precisely so that nothing unexpected could ever again threaten to undo her the way her father's death once had. She had not anticipated a storm. She had certainly not anticipated a duke. "We cannot remain here," Julian said, surveying the wreckage and the rapidly worsening storm with the particular calm of a man accustomed to managing crises. "There is a shepherd's cottage perhaps a quarter-mile up that ridge. I noticed it before the accident. It will have to serve until the storm passes." "And my trunk?" "Your trunk will survive considerably better than we will if we remain out here," Julian said. "I am sorry, Miss Pelham. We must leave it." The cottage, when they reached it, proved to be a single room with a low fire already laid by some absent shepherd, a narrow cot, and considerably less space than either of them would have preferred under the circumstances. "This is highly improper," Sarah said, surveying the room with growing dismay. "It is considerably more improper to die of exposure on a Yorkshire hillside," Julian said, already working to coax the fire back to life. "I am afraid propriety will have to accommodate itself to the weather, Miss Pelham." "You are remarkably calm for a man whose reputation is about to be thoroughly compromised." "My reputation," Julian said, "is the Duke of Northcombe's problem, and the Duke of Northcombe has weathered considerably worse than an unplanned night in a shepherd's cottage." Sarah's breath caught. "You are a duke." "I'd rather hope to introduce that detail more gradually," he said, with the first hint of dry humor she had heard from him. "I find it tends to alter how people speak to me, and I'd been enjoying the alternative." The fire caught properly within the hour, and the storm, rather than abating, settled into the particular fury of weather that intended to remain for some time. "You said the carriage was shared by coincidence," Sarah said, examining the room's single blanket with some suspicion as to how it would be fairly divided. "Where were you traveling, Your Grace?" "Toward my own estate, by a route considerably less direct than I intended. Having been delayed in London by business I would rather not have attended to at all." He paused. "I am engaged to be married, Miss Pelham. I feel I ought to mention that, given our circumstances." "I see." Sarah kept her voice carefully neutral. Should I expect your betrothed to arrive and discover us shortly?" "She is in London," Julian said. "The engagement was arranged by our families. Her fortune secures my estate's tenant improvements. My title secures her family's position. It is, by any reasonable measure, an excellent match." "You do not sound especially pleased about an excellent match." "I am pleased about the tenant improvements," he said. "I have not yet determined how I feel about the rest of it." By the second morning, the storm showed no sign of relenting, and Sarah had begun to suspect that propriety was the least of her concerns. "You read," Julian observed, finding her with the single book the cottage possessed. A worn volume of sermons, hardly thrilling, but better than nothing. "I read anything available," Sarah said. "I have not had much opportunity for selection these past 2 days." "What would you choose, given the opportunity?" "Something considerably less concerned with the wages of sin," Sarah said, "and considerably more concerned with actual people. Novels, mostly. My father disapproved. He believed fiction encouraged idle imagination in young women." "And did it?" "Tremendously," Sarah said. "I've imagined myself into circumstances considerably more interesting than my actual life on numerous occasions. I confess this particular circumstance was not among my imaginings, though it is proving rather instructive." Julian laughed, a real surprised sound, and Sarah found herself unexpectedly pleased to have caused it. "We have exhausted the bread," Julian announced, surveying the cottage's meager provisions with the particular gravity of a man unaccustomed to scarcity of any kind. "I confess I am uncertain what one does in this situation." "One manages," Sarah said, already moving past him to assess what remained. "There is cheese, a little dried meat the shepherd left behind, and a sack of oats I noticed in the corner. It is not elegant, Your Grace, but it will see us through another day or two." "You seem remarkably unbothered by the prospect of oats for breakfast." "I have eaten considerably worse during leaner years," Sarah said. "I find hunger is rather an effective teacher of gratitude. One learns to appreciate oats considerably more once the alternative has been nothing at all." Julian watched her divide their remaining provisions with brisk, practiced efficiency, an unfamiliar expression crossing his face. "I do not believe I've ever once gone hungry in my life," he admitted. "Not truly. I find I am rather ashamed of that, watching you manage this so calmly." "You need not be ashamed," Sarah said. "You did not choose your circumstances any more than I chose mine. I've simply had more practice at this particular skill than you have." "I find I am grateful for your practice, regardless of how it was acquired," he said, and meant it more sincerely than the words alone conveyed. "Tell me about your fiancé," Sarah said that evening as they sat on opposite sides of the small fire, the blanket divided with careful, deliberate fairness between them. "Lady Constance Whitmore," Julian said. "Beautiful, accomplished, entirely sensible about the practical requirements of marriage between families like ours. We have known each other since childhood. I do not dislike her. That is a rather low bar for a marriage." "It is a considerably higher bar than many marriages in my circle manage," Julian said. "My own parents disliked each other rather actively for 30 years. I had resigned myself to something more peaceable, even if peaceable meant something short of affection." "That sounds lonely," Sarah said quietly. "It has not felt particularly lonely," he said, "until rather recently." Sarah did not ask him to elaborate. She was not entirely certain she wanted to hear the answer, given how closely it seemed to be circling something she had been carefully not naming herself. "My father was a vicar," Sarah offered, unprompted, later that same evening when the silence between them had stretched long enough that she felt compelled to fill it with something true. A good man, though not always a practical one. He believed devoutly that virtue would be rewarded eventually, and spent considerably less time than he ought have on ensuring his daughter would be provided for, should that reward arrive too late. Did it arrive too late? "He died when I was 20, owing more in unpaid parish expenses than he left behind in savings," Sarah said. "I learned rather quickly that virtue, while admirable, does not pay a companion's wages or secure lodging. I've tried to hold both convictions since, his faith in goodness and my own insistence on practical survival. They do not always sit comfortably together." "I think they might," Julian said quietly. "I've watched you manage real hardship with more grace than most people manage minor inconvenience. That seems like goodness and practicality working rather well in tandem, regardless of how uncomfortable the combination feels from the inside." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, oddly moved by the observation. "You're more perceptive than your reputation suggests, Your Grace." "My reputation," Julian said, "has had very little occasion to be perceptive about anything beyond estate management and parliamentary procedure. I find this particular week is teaching me rather more than I expected." "You manage remarkably well for a woman traveling alone to a position considerably beneath her bearing," Julian observed, on the third morning, watching Sarah methodically organize the cottage's meager supplies with the same efficiency she had brought to nearly everything since the accident. "I've managed alone for some years," Sarah said. "My father died when I was 20. My mother some years before that. I have an aunt in Bath who requires companionship and can offer modest payment in return. It is not a glamorous arrangement, Your Grace, but it is an honest one. You do not resent it?" "I resented it considerably for the first year," Sarah admitted. "I've since decided that resentment accomplishes very little beyond making an already difficult situation more exhausting to endure. I would rather simply manage it." "That is a remarkably practical philosophy." "I have found practicality considerably more useful than romance," Sarah said, "though I confess this particular week has rather tested that conviction." Julian looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his grey eyes. "It has tested mine as well," he said quietly. The third night brought a cold sharp enough that propriety yielded finally to simple necessity, and they sat close together near the dwindling fire, the single blanket shared between them out of plain practicality, rather than any decision either of them announced aloud. "I've spent 3 days waiting for you to behave as I expected a duke to behave," Sarah admitted, watching the flames rather than him. "Demanding, impatient, irritated by the inconvenience of ordinary hardship. You have not done any of that." "What did you expect, precisely?" "Someone considerably less willing to share the last of the cheese," Sarah said, and felt him laugh beside her, low and real. "I find I have very little patience left for the version of myself that would have behaved that way," Julian said. "I am not entirely certain when that changed. Possibly somewhere around the moment you organized our remaining provisions with more competence than my own housekeeper manages an entire week's menu." "That is a rather low bar for admiration, Your Grace." "It is the only bar I have had occasion to measure against these past 3 days," he said, "and you have cleared it rather thoroughly, on every count I can think to name." Sarah did not answer immediately. The fire crackled low between them, and outside the wind continued its relentless assault on the cottage's thin walls, and she found, with some private alarm, that she did not particularly want the storm to end at all. The storm broke on the 4th morning, and a search party, organized by Julian's own household once his absence became sufficiently alarming, found them within the hour. The relief of rescue was almost immediately complicated by the realization of what 4 days alone, unchaperoned, would mean for both their reputations once the story inevitably spread. "I will speak to my solicitor," Julian said, as they were bundled into a fresh carriage. "Whatever protection your reputation requires, Miss Pelham, I intend to provide it." "And your engagement?" He did not answer immediately, which told Sarah considerably more than any words might have. Lady Constance Whitmore arrived at Northcombe House 3 days after Julian's return to London, having heard, through channels considerably faster than official correspondence, exactly what had transpired in that Yorkshire cottage. "4 days," she said, settling into the drawing-room with the particular coldness of a woman who had clearly rehearsed this conversation extensively before arriving. 4 days alone with a vicar's daughter travelling to a companion's position. I confess I did not expect this particular complication from you, Julian." "It was an accident, Constance. The storm." "The storm did not require you to look at her the way half of London is already whispering you did when the search party found you both." Her gaze cut towards Sarah, who had been summoned with some reluctance to address the matter directly. "Miss Pelham, I understand congratulations may be premature, but I confess I am curious what your intentions are, given the considerable damage already done to my own prospects by this unfortunate accident." "I have no intentions beyond honesty, Lady Constance," Sarah said evenly. "I did not arrange the storm, nor the broken wheel, nor anything that followed." "No," Constance agreed coldly. "But I do wonder whether you have done a great deal to encourage what followed, once the opportunity presented itself. A duke is rather a significant prize for a woman in your circumstances." "That is unfair," Julian said sharply. "Is it?" Constance turned to him with icy precision. "I have known you since we were children, Julian. I have never once seen you look at me the way I am told you looked at her in that search party's report. Whatever this is, I would rather know plainly than continue pretending toward a marriage neither of us actually wants." She departed without waiting for an answer, and the drawing-room fell into a silence considerably heavier than the one that had followed their rescue. "She's not entirely wrong," Sarah said quietly once Constance had gone. "I've spent 3 days telling myself this was simply circumstance. I am no longer certain that is true. It stopped being simply circumstance for me somewhere around the 2nd night," Julian said. "I've been attempting, rather unsuccessfully, to convince myself otherwise ever since." "You have gone very quiet since that woman left," Sarah's aunt observed, the elderly relation she had originally been travelling to assist, who had insisted Sarah recover at her own modest house in the days following the rescue rather than return immediately to London society's scrutiny. "Lady Constance said some rather pointed things," Sarah admitted, settling onto the small sofa beside her aunt's chair. "That I encouraged the entire situation. that a duke is rather too significant a prize for a woman in my circumstances to resist pursuing, given the opportunity. Do you believe that of yourself?" "I do not know what I believe anymore," Sarah said. "I went into that storm a sensible woman with a sensible plan, and I have come out the other side feeling things I have spent 4 years training myself not to feel, for precisely the reasons Lady Constance suggested. Wanting things costs a great deal when one cannot necessarily keep them." Her aunt was quiet for a long moment. "I have known you since you were a girl, Sarah," she said finally. "I have watched you manage your father's death, and considerable hardship besides, with a steadiness that frightened me rather more than it should have, because steadiness that complete often comes at the cost of ever allowing yourself to want anything at all. I do not believe you encouraged this situation. I believe a storm finally gave you permission to want something you had been refusing yourself for years. And if it ends badly, if he returns to Constance or to sense or to whatever his family expects of him, then you will have lost something," her aunt said, "rather than having never risked anything at all. I have watched you choose the second option for 4 years, my dear. I do not believe it has made you particularly happy." He found her in his own library 2 days later, having sent word that he wished to speak with her plainly, away from his mother's watchful supervision and the considerable gossip already circulating through London's drawing-rooms. "I've ended the engagement," he said, without preamble. "Constance and I spoke again this morning. She agreed in the end that neither of us was being honest about what we actually wanted, and that continuing would have made fools of us both." Sarah's breath caught. "Julian." "I love you," he said, plainly, thus that he had come to say most things in her presence over 4 unexpected days. Not because of the storm or the accident or the considerable scandal this entire situation has produced. Because you organized a shepherd's cottage with more competence than most hostesses manage a ballroom. Because you have spent years managing genuine hardship without once allowing it to make you bitter. Because I've known Constance my entire life and never once felt what I felt watching you read sermons by firelight because nothing better was available. I have spent 4 years convincing myself that practicality was preferable to wanting things I could not have," Sarah said, her eyes bright. "I do not know how to simply want something without immediately calculating what it might cost me to lose it." "Then let me make the calculation easier," Julian said. "I am not offering you a complicated practical arrangement. I am offering you a genuine one. I love you, entirely and specifically, and I would like the rest of my life to reflect that, rather than the convenient arrangement I had resigned myself to before a storm intervened." "That is not a particularly romantic way to propose, Your Grace." "I am not a particularly romantic man," he said. "I am a man who has been entirely, specifically undone by a woman who organizes shepherds' cottages and argues about novels and manages hardship without ever once asking for pity. I find romance considerably less interesting than honesty, and you're the most honest thing that has happened to me in years." "Yes," Sarah said. "Yes, what?" "Yes to all of it. The storm, the scandal, Constance's fury, every bit of it." He crossed the small distance between them and kissed her with a gentleness that told her everything the past 4 years of careful practicality had failed to provide. And outside the library windows, London continued its ordinary business, entirely unaware that the season's most discussed scandal had just resolved itself into something considerably more permanent. They married quietly in early winter, the wedding small by ducal standards and attended by precisely the people who mattered most to both of them. Lady Constance Whitmore married a considerably wealthier earl within the year, by all accounts considerably happier for the change, and sent the new Duchess of Northcombe a card of genuine, if slightly wry, congratulation. 4 years later, the library at Northcombe House holds, on a snowy winter evening, eerily reminiscent of the storm that began everything, a fire burning steadily, 2 children variously occupied across the room, and considerably more warmth than either Julian or Sarah anticipated when they first found shelter in a shepherd's cottage. "Papa, tell the story again," demands their eldest 4-year-old Henry, climbing onto his father's lap with the particular insistence of a child who has heard a favorite tale dozens of times and shows no sign of tiring of it. "Which story?" Julian asks, though he knows perfectly well which one Henry means. "The storm story, where you and Mama got lost." "We were not lost," Sarah says, from her chair by the fire, where their younger daughter, 2-year-old Eleanor, has fallen asleep against her shoulder. "We were extremely inconveniently located." "Tell it anyway," Henry insists. Julian obliges, recounting the overturned carriage and the rain in the cottage, with the particular embellishment a father reserves for his children's favorite tales, and Henry listens with rapt attention to a story he has clearly already memorized, interjecting corrections whenever Julian dares to alter even the smallest detail. "You forgot the part about the blanket," Henry says, with great seriousness. "I did not forget it," Julian says. "I am building suspense." "There is no suspense. I already know the ending." "There is always suspense," Julian says, "in the telling, even when you already know how it ends." Sarah's aunt, who has come to live in a comfortable cottage on the Northcombe estate at her niece's insistence, arrives shortly after for her customary evening visit, settling into her usual chair by the fire with the easy familiarity of someone who has earned a permanent place in this household. "He is still telling that story," she observes, with the same fond exasperation she has expressed at this particular habit for several years running. "Henry requests it nightly," Julian says, by way of defense. "I find I cannot refuse a child his favorite tale, regardless of how many times I've already told it." "You used to tell me," Sarah's aunt says to her niece, "that you did not believe in risking anything you could not afford to lose. I notice you have built an entire household around the one time you did precisely that." "The storm rather forced the matter," Sarah says. "I am not certain I deserve full credit for the risk." "You deserve credit for what you did once the risk presented itself," her aunt says. "Plenty of sensible women would have spent 4 days in that cottage protecting themselves so thoroughly they never once let themselves feel anything real. You did not do that. I have always believed that mattered considerably more than the storm itself." Sarah watches her husband and son with quiet contentment, Eleanor's small weight warm against her shoulder, and thinks, as she has thought often in 4 years of marriage, that practicality had never once prepared her for the particular, unreasonable joy of a love she had not planned for and could not have calculated her way toward. "Do you remember," Julian says, once Henry has finally exhausted his questions and wandered off toward his own small bed, that Lady Constance accused you of encouraging the entire situation. I remember, Sarah says. I believe I told her, quite truthfully, that I had not arranged the storm. You did not arrange the storm, Julian agrees. I have, however, come to believe rather firmly that some things arrange themselves regardless of anyone's intentions, and I have stopped questioning why.
He reaches for her hand, and the fire burns steadily against the winter cold outside, and the library that once belonged to a duke who had resigned himself to peaceable convenience now holds, instead, an entire, small, and deeply loved family, exactly where neither of them expected to be, and precisely where both of them intend to stay. The end. Dear listener, perhaps you have spent years believing that practicality and genuine happiness were simply different categories of life, and that choosing one meant permanently forfeiting the other. Sarah did not go looking for love. She was traveling toward a modest, sensible arrangement, the kind she had built her entire adult life around, when circumstance, uninvited, inconvenient, entirely beyond her control, interrupted everything she had carefully planned. She did not trust it immediately. She had spent too many years learning that wanting things came with costs she could not always afford. But she let herself, eventually, want this one thing anyway. So many of us have built careful, practical lives specifically to protect ourselves from disappointment. We tell ourselves that contentment is the most we should reasonably expect, that genuine joy is for people with fewer responsibilities, fewer hardships, fewer reasons to be cautious. We mistake guardedness for wisdom, when sometimes it is simply fear wearing a more respectable name. If you are 40 or 50 or further along, and you have spent years choosing the sensible path because the alternative felt too risky to consider, please hear this gently. It is not foolish to want more than mere management. It is not naive to hope that something unplanned might still find you exactly as you are and turn out to be the truest thing that ever happened to your careful, practical life. Storms end. Shelter is found. And sometimes, in the most inconvenient circumstances imaginable, something real finally has room to grow. Tonight, as you rest, let yourself consider what you might be protecting yourself from by staying so carefully practical. Sleep well, dear friend. The unplanned things are not always the dangerous ones. With love. From all of us at Fables of Love. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this story. If it made you laugh, cry, or believe in love all over again, we would be so grateful if you liked this video, left a comment, and subscribed to the channel. Sharing it with someone who loves historical romance means the world to us and keeps our storytelling corner alive. Another story is waiting for you at the end of this video. Click, listen, and let your heart be swept away once more. From all of us at Fables of Love, thank you for being here.